It is truly a case of push coming to shove and emotions running high. In the face of tough threats from Donald Trump, Iran immediately issued an equally fierce, retaliatory message, declaring it would create surprises for both the US and Israel. This has drawn intense attention from observers. What exactly are those surprises? Heavy warheads, long-range missile systems, or military capabilities that remain strictly classified? The statements by Quds Force Commander Esmaeil Qa'ani are therefore no longer seen as mere propaganda, but as a sign that an asymmetric deterrence strategy is gradually emerging. Tehran is believed to be eschewing direct conventional warfare where they would be at a disadvantage in favor of preparing unpredictable moves, maximizing their network of proxy forces and non-traditional combat tools. In a context where the balance of power tips toward the US and Israel, this approach allows Iran to exert multi-layered pressure without entering a total war. Analysts suggest that the surprises Iran mentions likely lie not in the scale of the attack, but in the method and timing, factors that could exceed the scenarios calculated by Washington and Tel Aviv. Consequently, Tehran's recent moves, from military signaling to diplomatic declarations, are assessed as intentional, maintaining a state of deterrence while still controlling the escalation threshold. The issue now is no longer whether Iran will act, but how they will act to exert effective pressure while avoiding pushing the region into a full-scale conflict. Regarding the surprises emphasized by Tehran, the first scenario to be dismissed is a direct conventional attack. Given the current balance of power, it is difficult for Iran to go toe-to-toe with the US or Israel in terms of air power, naval strength, or modern military technology. Therefore, their choice lies not in matching strength, but in fighting differently. Analysts believe Tehran has long shaped a military doctrine based on avoiding head-on collisions, instead dragging the opponent into dispersed conflict zones where technological superiority is no longer the absolute deciding factor. The core of this strategy lies in the proxy warfare model. Iran does not need to appear directly on the battlefield. Instead, it acts through allied and affiliated forces in the region, such as Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, or Shiite militias in Iraq. These forces function as extended arms, allowing Tehran to expand its influence and apply pressure on multiple fronts simultaneously without bearing the full cost of an official war. Notably, these hotspots stretch from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, creating a strategic belt capable of forcing the US and Israel to disperse their resources if conflict escalates. Parallel to this is the development of asymmetric combat capabilities. Iran has invested significantly in its arsenal of long-range missiles, UAVs, and cyber warfare tools. Low cost means that possess the potential to cause major damage if deployed at the right time. In this logic, the surprise is not found in absolute destructive power, but in the method of deployment. An attack on an unexpected target, a strike on sensitive infrastructure, or even activities that disrupt supply chains. It is precisely this element of unpredictability that creates real pressure, forcing the opponent to remain in a constant state of high alert. This strategy cannot be separated from another of Iran's crucial cards, the Strait of Hormuz. This is the world's vital energy transport artery, through which a significant portion of the global oil supply passes daily. In an escalation scenario, even a single move to restrict traffic in this area would be enough to create a massive shock to energy markets. Oil prices could skyrocket, leading to a chain reaction of consequences for the global economy, from inflation to trade disruptions. As such, the Strait of Hormuz is viewed as a specialized economic weapon, which in many cases carries even more weight than traditional military weaponry. Iran does not need a total blockade. Merely creating enough risk to make the markets react is sufficient to achieve the goal of applying pressure. This is a form of indirect deterrence, striking at the vulnerability of the globalized system, where the stability of maritime routes is of vital importance. Conversely, the reactions from the US and Israel also demonstrate a state of both deterrence and caution. Donald Trump's ultimatum is characterized by a display of power and psychological pressure. aimed at forcing Tehran to think twice before taking any escalatory steps. Such tough rhetoric is not only directed at Iran, but also sends a message to other allies and rivals regarding Washington's readiness to act. However, behind these strong statements lies a more complex reality. The US, despite possessing overwhelming military superiority, must still carefully calculate the risk of being drawn into a protracted war in the Middle East, something that has left many consequences in the past. A full-scale conflict with Iran would not only be militarily costly, but also carries the risk of spreading across the entire region. For Israel, the equation is even more sensitive. The greatest risk comes not just from Iran, but from the possibility of facing multiple fronts simultaneously, from Lebanon and Gaza to other regional hotspots. In that scenario, military advantages could be eroded. All these factors point to a state of straining on both sides. The US and Israel need to maintain enough pressure to deter, but must simultaneously avoid crossing the line that could trigger a total war. Conversely, Iran seeks to assert its capability and will without pushing the situation out of control. In that fragile balance, the surprise Tehran mentions is not just a tactic, but a tool to reshape the game, where unpredictability becomes the greatest strategic advantage. In that tense tug-of-war, diplomacy still exists as a pressure relief valve, but it is clearly very fragile and lacks substantive momentum. Statements from Russia regarding its readiness to play a mediating role show that Moscow is looking to capitalize on the influence vacuum in a crisis where the direct parties have yet to find common ground. Russia's representative in Vienna, Mikhail Ulyanov, is believed to have signaled that a dialogue process could still be initiated, at least on a technical and diplomatic level. However, the reality is much more complicated. The US has shown little interest in the role of a third party, as Washington still believes it has enough leverage to handle the issue on its own terms. Meanwhile, Iran does not refuse dialogue but sets conditions that are difficult to accept immediately, particularly regarding security guarantees and the lifting of sanctions. This gap in positions makes any mediation efforts precarious, as neither side is truly ready to make concessions to create a breakthrough. This means that current diplomacy is primarily gatekeeping, preventing the conflict from spiraling out of control, rather than a clear path leading to a solution. Communication channels remain open, but a lack of strategic trust makes every proposal prone to deadlock. In such an environment, just one miscalculation or an unintended incident could quickly push the situation into a more dangerous trajectory. And it is at this point that the greatest risk begins to emerge. The conflict is no longer confined to the region. Reports regarding an Iranian attack on Diego Garcia, a strategic US and UK base in the Indian Ocean, are seen as a particularly notable escalation. This is not merely a military action, it is a signal that the operational range could be expanded beyond the Middle East, touching other critical geostrategic spaces. If this scenario continues, the conflict will no longer be a story between Iran, the US, and Israel, but risk spreading to global maritime routes where the interests of many major nations intersect. The Indian Ocean, acting as a trade and military artery, could become a new front, drawing in the involvement or at least the reaction of other great powers. At that point, any disruption would not only impact regional security, but also directly affect trade flows, energy, and global supply chains. The most worrying risk lies in the domino effect. A limited attack could lead to a retaliatory response, and from there, escalate into a chain of action-reaction that is difficult to control. In an environment where all parties pursue a deterrence strategy but lack effective crisis control mechanisms, the line between sending a message and triggering a conflict becomes extremely thin. Overall, the surprise that Iran emphasizes seems to lie not in what kind of weapons they possess, but in how they choose to use what they have. It is a strategic approach, avoiding direct confrontation, not flaunting their full capabilities, but maximizing the element of uncertainty to gain an advantage. In such a standoff, strength is no longer measured by the scale of firepower, but by the ability to keep the opponent from predicting exactly what will happen next. The world is therefore witnessing the shaping of a new type of confrontation, one where war is no longer limited to clear battle lines, but spreads through multiple layers: military, economic, technological, and psychological. This is a complex game where every move is calculated to both exert pressure and avoid crossing the danger threshold. The question remains, in such a fragile balance, who will be the first to cross the line? And when that happens, will existing control mechanisms be enough to prevent a crisis from exceeding the regional scope and becoming a global flashpoint?